Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 quick match gameplay. This time around I'm playing as the dwarves against the greenskins led by Parmigiano on the map Ethel Tamarha. And trying out, I suppose not really trying out on much of a build, just kind of testing out what kind of build the new dwarves can really bring against the greenskins. Obviously there have been a lot of changes to both the greens, or a lot of buffs I suppose to both greenskins and dwarves. Most greenskin infantry has really benefited from the HP buffs. Black orcs and normal orcs now have a lot more HP per model, or at least the big guns, I do believe. And of course, black orcs have by far the biggest amount of HP of any unit in the game, or any infantry model in the game. And so I kind of wanted to see how the dwarves, what kind of strat the dwarves could bring against them. And going into this, I really anticipated my opponent to bring a very black orc heavy build. I anticipated basically straight black orcs. So for my lord, I did actually decide to bring a rune lord. This was because I was kind of anticipating Azag. Azag's a pretty popular pick in my opinion. He's just the best pick if you're playing as greenskins. So I did bring Rune Lord, of course, with on his Anvil of Doom, so that he's hard to knock about, and that does give him 40% magic resistance, 15% missile resistance, and some physical resistance. So he's pretty tanky. He's got 120 armor, decent melee defense. He doesn't hit very hard. He doesn't really have great melee attack or anything like that, but he is hard to knock about. He also grants immunity to psychology in an AoE bout himself, provides a slight boost to armor piercing damage, and most importantly, of course, does have his Master Runes, which includes the Master Rune of Oath and Steel, which is a buff to armor. Now, you may be thinking that's kind of dumb, given that I was expecting Black Orcs, but, of course, you can't just do a list of straight Black Orcs. There are going to be support units, there are going to be Savage Orcs, that sort of stuff, usually. And for those, and possibly some ranged units, and for those, the Master Rune of Oath and Steel is very helpful still. The Master Rune of Wrath and Ruin, of course, just very useful damage spell, but it does have a slight speed debuff, so potentially if I really need to, I can use it as a snare. And then a Master Rune of Negation, which of course is just a powerful ward save. And alongside him, I did bring two Thanes. On one of the Thanes, I only brought the Tormentor Sword, or both of them, I guess I brought the Tormentor Sword. And on the one over here, on this right-hand Thane, I did bring the Master Rune of Stromney Redbeard, which is an AoE buff to melee attack and leadership. I would have brought it on both if I had the points available, but I did not, so I was forced to give it up on one of the Thanes. My front line is composed entirely of Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. These mixed in with this unit of Grumbling Guard there to back them up. These guys, of course, are fairly cheap. Their stats have been buffed in this last patch, especially with the help of the Thane nearby. They should definitely be performing fairly well. They did get a Chevron just from some spare points that were laying around. They hit fairly hard. They've just been buffed across the board. They're fairly tanky against non-Black Orc units, and they have a decent charge bonus. They're just not a bad unit overall, given that they're fairly cheap. Especially backed by the Grumbling Guard, who will reduce the amount of vigor they're losing. The Grumbling Guard is, of course, a very powerful great weapon unit, or a great weapon force, but it is important to keep in mind that most of the Dwarven great weapons have very, very low melee attack. 34 is honestly not impressive for a great weapon, or not that impressive for a higher end great weapon unit, especially given that these guys are rank 9, and 23, as we can see on the Dwarf Warriors, is nothing to brag about. So I'm really kind of hoping that the Thanes and the support from my fire support from my range contingent will help. Finally, I do have a unit of PK Guard here to flesh out my front line. These guys do have armor piercing, magic attacks, which will be good against Savage Orcs, huge weapon strength, crazy melee stats, good armor, immunity to psychology. These guys are just strong across the board. And my hope is that they will be able to just beat the snot out of whatever they come across in a one-to-one fight. Behind them, I do have 2 units of Thunderers and the Ulthar's Raiders, the hope being that, of course, the Mark of Ulthar and combined with the Focused Fire of Thunderers can hopefully delete some units, help me soften up enemy Black Orcs, that sort of stuff. Generally, Dwarf units can shoot over their own troops, just because their troops are very short. Then I do have 2 units of Slayers in the back, Dragonback Slayers and normal Slayers. Slayers have actually been dropped in price, they're actually, of course, Orcs can bring a decent amount of large, but so these guys can shut that down. But they'll also actually prove fairly useful against, for example, Savage Orcs with their total lack of armor, or Goblins and dirt cheap greenskin units as well. These guys will tear through them rather quickly. And in the worst case, and if push comes to shove, they can even be used to stiffen up the front line. For my opponent, he did bring a and you can see we're posturing here. I'm trying to move up to the hill. And get I should have probably deployed closer to the woods. I definitely make the mistake. I underestimate just how much of a ridge there is here, and so my Thunderers are not able to get a firing arc on the Black Orcs. Definitely not in a timely manner. My opponent is deploying very wide. He did bring Azag, which is not entirely surprising, though it is surprising that he's on foot. He's brought Spirit Leech, Fate of Buna, while of course He's actually just a powerful lord in general. One of the interesting things, though, is that he did bring Get On With It, which is, in my opinion, not really worthwhile. Plus 8% charge bonus is not that impressive, given that usually with Azag you're usually kind of just charging once with, for example, Black Orcs, and then you're not really getting much out of it afterwards. You can see it's only 2 difference on the Black Orcs. But my opponent has done a very wide build. You can see he's got more Grobs Magi Marauders here in the back. These guys have armor piercing. They could definitely lay the hurt down on my Ulthar's Raiders or on my Peak Gate Guard or some of my high value targets, my Grumbly Guard, and that could definitely be a nuisance. His front line is actually composed of goblins, and that is actually not the worst idea, just because these guys are dirt cheap and they have silver shields, so they can absorb thunder, fire, they're expendable, and they can just soak hits. They are backed up by a handful of Savage Orcs, 2 units of them, on the flank, out on kind of the peripheries, and these guys are there to kind of flank, try to sneak past, dive into me, and then 3 units of Black Orcs make up the core of the army just to kind of plow into my troops and hold them in place and hopefully win in a straight-up attritional battle, especially with the help of Fate of Buna and these Goblin Big Bosses mounted on their spiders, who of course will be providing poison. Finally, my opponent does have 2 Orc Boar Chariots. These guys have armor piercing, anti-infantry, very high charge bonus, actually decent armor, and if they're able to push through, these guys could definitely cause some mayhem in my backline. Finally, the rest of the errors will make sure that the otherwise fairly helpless goblins and Savage Orcs can dish out a decent amount of hurt against the Dwarf Infantry just by debuffing their armor. So that is in the full gear here. I'm pushing my Rune Lord a little forward, just trying to kind of soak up the charge if possible. My formation has been deformed a little bit as I'm trying to move units into position. You can see I do get a launch a charge here. The Dwarf Warriors actually have a decent charge bonus, but this is a very poor charge, I suppose, so I should say. Over here, rather than using the Dwarf Warriors to intercept these Savage Orcs, I use the Slayers for this. And Slayers, of course, will outtrade the Savage Orcs in the long run, especially when they catch them like this and the Savage Orcs don't get their massive charge bonus. Over here, these Black Orcs are getting hit by Master Rune of Wrath and Ruin, hit and flanked by the Dwarf Warriors, and now are getting absolutely taken apart. The Thane is in there. I've not popped the Tormentor Sword yet, but now over here I have, just to shut down these Orc Boar Chariots. Normally these guys would just plow straight through and go into my backline, but thanks to the Tormentor Sword and the Master Mark by Ulthar, these guys are actually just going to get annihilated by concentrated Ranger Fire as well as Thunder Fire. Unfortunately, the Moonhowlers, who I actually forgot to mention, are around, and they do dive into the backline here and start tearing through Ulthar's Raiders, who aren't, well, they're not pushovers in melee. They won't really be able to win when they're this depleted already by the Mogreb's Magi Marauders. Over here, though, the Boar Chariots have been completely annihilated, and this frees up some units to really pincer these Goblin Big Bosses and these Goblins over here and just kind of start deleting them. See, another unit of Orc Boar Chariots has been caught by the Tormentor Sword and is being completely taken apart by the Rune Lord, the Grumbling Guard, and all those units. They were just not able to push through, really. They got caught. Over here, Fate of Buna does go down the Peak Gate Guard, who, despite their magic resistance, are going to get taken apart. I definitely perhaps should have tried to invest in a rune to improve magic resistance on all my units by 15% from on the Rune Lord, but I did not. I figured it wasn't really worthwhile, but could have definitely helped here with the Peak Gate Guard. We're now fighting for their life against the Black Orcs, having been debuffed quite a bit, but with the help of the Dwarf Warriors, I'm still hoping they can come out on top. Over here, I'm definitely struggling a bit to cover all my flanks. You can see these Goblins are coming in, though it's definitely a little bit belated for my opponent. The Thunderers will, of course, trade somewhat effectively with Savage Orcs, though not amazingly well, and I'm pushing these Dragonback Slayers into the fray just to tie these guys down. And the Dragonback Slayers, with their built-in physical resist and high weapon strength, will actually tear through Savage Orcs pretty effectively. In the meantime, over here, the Thanes and the Rune Lord are just slugging out with the Black Orcs. They're beating down the Goblin Big Boss. Azak has actually pulled out of the fray, which is a little interesting, that my opponent did not keep him in there. Azak's no pushover in melee. He definitely has decent melee attack. The defense is not amazing, but it's workable. The Gobos do get on top of my Thunders, which is frustrating, but they won't really be able to do very much damage because, of course, Thunders are very powerful. Now, the Mogreb's Magi Marauders are starting to wail on the Peak Gate Guard, which actually has a surprising amount of models left, and that's because Fate of Buna doesn't really go after models, it just causes damage across the board. But hopefully these Black Orcs will go down before the Peak Gate Guard gets shot down, which is happening fairly quickly. Over here you can see the Black Orcs over here finally getting taken apart by a second rune of Master Rune of Wrath and Ruin. This Goblin Big Boss is being routed off. These Black Orcs have finally been broken, and these Slayers are finally freed up, having wiped out the Savage Orcs. Definitely was not an efficient trade, but it did give me a win on this flank. It made sure that one of my opponent's most dangerous units was dealt with. Now these Goblins are going to fight against the Dragonback Slayers. They actually can do some decent damage to Dragonback Slayers who don't really have much survivability outside of that physical resistance, but they're definitely not going to win the long run. Thunderers, in the meantime, are zoning away or working on these Mogreb's Magi Marauders. It's a bit of overkill, the armor piercing and all that, but definitely it's still not bad, and hopefully frees up some of my surviving infantry models who are kind of dying here. You can see the Rustiers are shooting into these poor Dwarf Warriors, but at this point of the game, I'm not really too concerned about them. I'm not really concerned about this Goblin Big Boss. I'm simply trying to mop up my opponent's troops, deal with these annoying Moon Howlers, and just kind of finish off my opponent's troops. You can see the Slayers get on top of these Moon Howlers, and that's going to be a very, very bad time for him. And I actually do catch poor Isaac over here with the Tormentor Sword right on the edge of the cast range, or the effect range, and now I'm able to catch up with him. This second Thane almost has a Tormentor Sword back off cooldown, and at this point my opponent does decide to withdraw from the game. As I do have two very healthy units of Thunderers who, if he tries to flee, we'll just shoot him down. So yeah, it was definitely a bit of a tight fight. My opponent did manage to break some flanks, and I think he had a little more coordination with the Goblins. It could have definitely turned out a lot worse for me. I definitely think it shows just how much the snares are helping the Dwarves. Normally, had this been Warhammer 1, my opponent's chariots would have simply plowed straight through my front line, maybe gotten snared up a little bit, maybe slowed down a tiny bit, but then they would have just force pathed their way through and been in my back line and been tying down my Thunderers, tying down my Rangers. I wouldn't have had the resources to commit to deal with them. And this way they just got caught up on the front line and massacred, essentially. They got taken to task by the mix of the Thanes and my ranged fire and all that sort of stuff. It's a little hard to tell just how good units performed in this fight, given that most of these troops fought against goblins and low-end infantry, which kind of inflates the kill ratios. The Slayers definitely performed well, tearing through the Savage Orcs and tearing through some of the cheapo infantry. The poor Rangers got torn apart very, very quickly by the Moon Howlers. They don't have particularly good armor, and though their melee stats are not terrible, they're not really good enough to hold an engagement, even with something like, say, Moon Howlers, in my opinion. Especially not once they're whittled down a decent amount, like they were by the Mangy Marauders. I definitely think a lot of these units, of course, a lot of these kills are simply just goblins, and those are fairly irrelevant kills. The Grumbly Guard, I think, definitely helped solidify the center, as did the P8 Guard, who absorbed a lot of the casts from, or actually I think most of the casts from Azag, who was constantly trying to whittle them down. They took a lot of the attention away, and kind of became a focus for my opponent's fire. The Black Orcs actually did tie him down with a pretty disproportionate tie down. They got about 2,000 points worth of troops tied down a single unit of Black Orcs. But in the meantime, on the other parts of the flank, the map, the Slayers performed very well at mopping up cheap infantry. The Dwarf Warriors did well enough in the front line when backed by the Grumbling Guard and my heroes. And yeah, I think all over this build is just decent, if not amazing, against Orcs. For my opponent, I definitely don't think this is necessarily a bad build. I think he might have been better off bringing, say, a Gobbo Shaman with the Itchy Nuisance, for example, to provide some debuffs. Or perhaps I brought Azag on a Wyvern just so he could kind of crash through my line and cause terror, because a lot of these troops are still susceptible to terror. Perhaps I definitely think there were some things that you could have done a little differently, but definitely was a pretty interesting with flank and all. I think the Boar Cherries definitely getting bogged down by the Tormentor Sword was a bit of a misplay, and I think a lot of it just comes down to the fact that people are not used to playing against dwarves who can tie you down. Before, there was no way you were going to root your opponents as dwarves, basically, because Dragonback Slayers are slow and Grimbrindle had a flash bomb, and that was it. But now I actually had 4 crowd control abilities. I had Master Rune of Wrath and Ruin, I had the 2 Tormentor Swords, and of course Dragonback Slayers. So it's a very solid combo, I think, overall. Regardless, very good game to my opponent. It was a lot of fun. Definitely got some very good value out of these Mogrims, Mangy Marauders, picking apart my poor P8 Guard. I definitely don't think this is that bad of a build. I just think the deployment could have been a little better. And yeah, it was definitely interesting to see just sort of a lot of chaff and some pretty cool anti-armor and anti-infantry units in the mix. So good game to my opponent. I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any comments, criticism, any questions about Quick Match or Total War or any of that sort of stuff, be sure to post them down in the comments, and I will respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Wyvern out.